Hello, sir.
Hello.
Do you break the meta on purpose? Will we find out next?
No, it's just like I just genuinely fuck up.
Just like me. All right, take it away.
All right. Hello. So yeah, I'm gonna talk about balancing cards in Clash Royale, which is what I do quite often. At least try to do. All right. So the title of the talk is Quest for the Healthy Metagame: Balancing Cards in Clash Royale. Does this work? Yes, it works. Okay. Very short introduction first. So my name is Stefan Engblom. I work as game designer in the Clash Royale team in Supercell. I'm one of currently 17 developers. We just grew this month with 6%, so we got one new guy into the team. This is the core team basically that does all the decisions for Clash Royale, for the game itself, not necessarily for marketing, etc., but yeah, for the game itself. And while I'm the only one with the title game designer, everybody really is involved in game design and pitches in on the games. Everybody is a game designer basically in the team. And my focus is on balancing the cards, balancing the gameplay, on the game economy and on system design. But here as well, I'm going to focus now in this talk about the balancing of cards, which is perhaps the one that I'm most passionate about, and also the one that I feel I've learned most about during the year that I worked on the team. So I have worked on the team for a year, which is like from the right after the launch, the global launch of the game. But I have had the privilege to like work at Supercell before that and follow the whole process of developing the game, playing a lot in the internal playables, giving feedback, etc. So it's been an awesome journey to see how Clash Royale was born and now also like developing it further. So all right, so let's get going. So I'm going to talk about a few different topics. First, I'm going to introduce Clash Royale a little bit, talk a little bit about what it's about, and talk about things like, for example, how we do the upgrade levels. Then I'm going to talk about the goals of balancing, why do we do balancing, and what do we try to achieve with it. I'm going to talk about the principles that, what happened to my screen? All right. Anyways, so I'm going to talk about the principles, what we think about when we do the balancing, when we make new cards, etc. And in the last chapter, I'm going to talk about things we take into considerations when we do the decisions on like which cards to rebalance and so forth, and why do we end up with the decisions that we do. Right, so a little bit about Clash Royale. I'm going to ask a bit differently. How many here have played every day for the past 7 days? Cool, nice. How many have reached 3,000 trophies? Cool. How many have ever played Clash Royale? Okay, I hope you'll come back someday. Okay, so Clash Royale has its roots in collectible card games like Magic the Gathering and Hearthstone, and also in MOBAs like League of Legends and Dota, Heroes of the Storm, etc. But it's a bit of a unique experience catered for mobile. It takes a bit from those worlds and it's been made for mobile. You build decks, you enter battle, and you go into real-time PvP using Elixir, this resource called Elixir that generates over time to cast cards. It's a 3-minute match with 1 minute overtime. You try to kill the enemy towers. And usually like at 30 seconds, it's already like total mayhem on the field and very action-packed. And despite the fact that like troops are like moving by themselves, there's quite a lot of depth in like timing the card placement, managing Elixir, managing the deck cycle, etc. And a little bit about the card stats. This is like an aspect for the game balancing because like even the most vanilla card, like the Knight, actually has quite a lot of stats and quite a lot of parameters going on for it. If you compare to, for example, Magic the Gathering, where you have a vanilla card, it only has attack, defense, or attack, health, and a mana cost, and that's it. But for us, it's like it's elixir cost, it's hit points, it's damage per second, hit speed, moving speed, deploy time, range, etc., etc. So there's a lot going on even in the most vanilla card. And then there's more complex cards like the Electro Wizard, which is a legendary card. You deploy it, it creates a zap effect, it shoots multiple targets from a range and stuns them as well as dealing damage. So there's a lot going on. So as a reference point, I like to think more that these are a bit closer to, let's say, heroes in League of Legends than cards in, for example, Hearthstone. That there's so many parameters that you can tweak, and it has its pros and cons when it comes to, like, from balancing perspective. Like, it's really good that you have all these different parameters that you can really tweak, like 5% here, or only tweak the moving speed here or the hit speed, and it can have like small effects rather than like doing, that you just want to increase the attack and you actually have to do like a 20% increase to even like when you change it like one integer. So there's a lot of benefits as well, but it also makes it a bit challenging, like what are the ramifications of like changing this one parameter, and even the most vanilla things are really complex. You don't have like as clear reference points to base your balancing on. Something I want to talk about a little bit more here now, like spend a few minutes, is the upgrade levels and how we do that. So that things wouldn't be as simple, we've also added the upgrade levels and balancing of that. So I'll start with commons. So commons have 13 levels, and whenever you increase a level, we increase the damage and hit points, but never anything else. Exactly 10% of damage and 10% of hit points. What this does is that it ensures that the interactions remain the same. So if we have, for example, the archers and versus the goblins, the archers exactly two-shot a goblin at level 1. They deal a little bit of damage, and the only thing that changes when they come to level 13, the interaction remains the same. It's again exactly 2 shots, but the damage and hit points are just a bit higher. So this helps keep me a little bit more sane when doing this stuff, so that you have like the interactions remain the same. So how do we do it then from the different rarities? So it's actually quite simple. So for rares, we just start at a higher level. So we start at level 3, and then we increase the same amount. So if we do a rare card, we basically, the level 1 rare has the same stats as a level 3 common would have. The epics we start from level 6, and the legendaries from level 9. And at level 9 we have what we call a tournament cap. So when we balance these cards, we tend to like balance them at the tournament cap. And what happens like with the level differences in the ladder play is basically that like we think of it more of as a spice to the game. Of course, we pay attention to that as well. Like when does what are the interactions if you have like one level higher or one level lower, and ensure that those interactions are interesting, that there are some reasons to level up a card, for example, that it actually creates a meaning. For example, the fireball, if it's one level above the musketeer, it will one-shot it, etc. But the main place where we really focus is the tournament cap, which essentially has the same balance then as max level, because there's the 10% increments. And the tournament cap is which we use, for example, in our challenge mode and in esports, and also in for example, the 2v2 mode that maybe some of you have tried. And when it comes to like the different rarities, the idea is not that legendaries are explicitly better than commons or rares. It's more like that they have more exotic and unique mechanics that they also. Maybe they are a bit more versatile in general, like the Electro Wizard does a lot of different things, but they are not meant to be like strictly better. And some of the best deck archetypes out there don't even use legendaries, and others use them more. So that's the goal. And the same applies to when you progress in arenas, that you are introduced to like a bit more exotic mechanics and more difficult cards to play. That's a cool way also to like introduce always like more difficult mechanics, and also helps when we create new content, of course, that the new players will have roughly the same experience, or at least the experience doesn't get ruined by like bloating the game with like hundreds of new cards for a new player. All right, so that was a little bit background and a little bit about the about Clash Royale, and then about the goals. So let's jump into that. So what are the goals of balancing? Why do we do balancing? What do we try to achieve with it? It's usually good to like figure out what your goals are before you start doing something. It helps when you have like a clear picture of where you're going. So for us, it's to provide fun and interesting gameplay. This also includes like gameplay depth, that you have that fun of like discovering stuff with the cards. The variety, that there would be like different deck archetypes that are viable, that it wouldn't be just one strategy and one play style that dominates the whole game. And freshness, that keeps the game fresh, not only like from the variety perspective, but also like from game to game. Maybe like your individual deck, there's different ways to play with it. You discover freshness in your own deck that you're playing, that depending on who you encounter, it actually plays a little bit differently. And also like that from game to game, like the opponents maybe play a little bit differently with different cards. So the game keeps fresh. And it also applies, of course, to new cards. New cards should keep the game fresh. All right. And if I would have to sum this in one phrase, or, well, 2 words, I would say that the goal of balancing is to have a healthy metagame. So I'll define next what I mean with metagame and what I mean with a healthy metagame. So let's start with metagame. I didn't find like any clear like dictionary terminology for this. There are some, and in the game industry as well, there's like different. When you talk with people about metagame, sometimes people talk about like the progress, etc., like of the game, the progress part. Sometimes it's about the gameplay interactions. So it varies a little bit. But for the purpose of this talk, I'll let the scholars like argue about the exact definitions. But for the purpose of this talk, it's cards, combinations, and strategies that the community at large have found most effective. So what that means is that the metagame is not something that we as developers create. We don't make the metagame. We have the balancing as a tool to tweak and try to influence where the community and where the players steer, but it's really the players that create it. They figure out the strategies. And I kind of like to think of it somehow like as we are the toy makers, and we create the toys for the players, and then they figure out crazy ways to use them. And quite often it's actually something we definitely didn't anticipate them to do. But that's also the exciting part of developing games, right? All right, so then what is then an unhealthy or healthy metagame? So let's start with like the extremes. But first, so it's like a state of what I was thinking that it's a kind of state of fun, variety, and freshness, which was the goal. So if you think about the extremes, then like a broken metagame would be one when there's no fun, no variety, no freshness. I don't think it's a realistic state for any game to be in, because you wouldn't make a game like that. So example of a broken metagame would be if there would be this kind of card that, it just wins the game straight out. But you wouldn't do this type of card, right? Like you already intuitively understand that this doesn't work. You can't have this card. It wouldn't create interesting gameplay. But likewise, a perfect metagame, I think, is like equally unrealistic. It's maybe something that's cool to strive for, something to have as a utopistic goal, but really like the state where like everything would be in absolute perfect balance, everything is in seamless harmony, and everybody is happy, and like it's a fantastic idea, but like really like people have so many different tastes. When you have thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of players, like you can't have the not everybody is happy always, and people have different tastes, etc. So good to have as a beacon, but don't be honest with yourself and don't think that you can ever reach it. Or if you can, please tell me how you did it. So instead, I think of it as like you have like unhealthy phases and healthy phases, unhealthy metagames and healthy metagames. So an unhealthy might be that it's kind of fun, but there's not that much variety. Maybe there's only 1 or 2 deck archetypes, and it doesn't feel very fresh. You keeps on playing like the same way, etc. But a healthy metagame, there's quite a bit of fun. Maybe there's some variety. It could be like a bit lower on one of these, but it's like a bit healthier state. Another way to look at this could be a diet. So you're eating hamburgers and fries. It's kind of cool. It's kind of fun, but you don't want to be there for a long time. It's not really good for you. Or then you have like this healthy diet where you want to be there for a long time. Yeah, I don't know what. This slide is kind of weird. Like I don't know what we're talking about here. Anyways. Okay, so that's healthy and unhealthy metagames. But so then about the principles. So how do we do it? What do we think about when we do the balancing? So let's go through some of the principles. So the first principle is to make everything feel overpowered. Yeah, any questions? No, just kidding. So the idea here is like, well, let me illustrate this with some examples. So if we think of balanced, like if we think of chess, like that's an archetype of like a balanced game, right? And if we would have a game where we only have chess soldiers duking it out, that would be like perfectly balanced, like everything would be great. But it wouldn't be very fun. Like it doesn't sound very exciting to me, at least, even if I am a hardcore board game. So instead, like an overpowered situation would be like the Marvel Avengers. Like they're certainly all overpowered, except maybe Black Widow and Hawkeye, but let's not talk about that right now. But like, yeah, they all have their own moments, their own situations where they are the best, or where they are like really feel overpowered. But in a way, like they are kind of balanced at the end of the day in their own way. So how do you make everything feel OP? It's a lot of course, like in the Avengers case, like you could argue that it's a lot about like character design and art style, which is true. But how do you make everything feel OP from a balancing perspective? So how do you make that like each hero feels OP without necessarily actually being OP? Or in the Clash Royale's case, how do you make every card feel OP? So one way to look at it is that each card needs its moment. Or more technically, there needs to be enough situations where the card can bring huge positive value. And here you could switch card out to be like hero or character, building, spell, whatever the game has. So make everything feel OP. And an example from Clash Royale is of a card that feels OP is Pekka. Especially to early players, she feels really OP. She is this huge, gigantic robot. Yeah, I know I'm saying she, like there's a lot of Finnish developers here, but yeah, let's not go there. Okay, so no one knows what she is. She deals like insane amounts of damage to a single target. When you encounter some of these guys, she just like smacks them, one-shots most of them, and still goes for the counter push. And if she reaches the towers, she just smacks them like with a few hits. She's really powerful in that moment where she's meant to shine. So everything is cool. Pekka is overpowered, but unfortunately everything also needs a counter. So in Pekka's case, there are plenty of counters, and among top players, she's not viewed as like as one of the like best cards in the game because there are so many ways to distract her. But that's really the point. Like you want to have something that feels OP without being it, so that there are counters and so that you have an evolving metagame. So you have counters, but you also have counters to those counters, and so the game evolves and the metagame evolves. Another thing that is good when you have counters, another like ramification of that is that it acts as a safety net. And there's an example of that, like a fairly recent card, the Elite Barbarians. So yeah, I made a few blunders with the balancing of those. So it started off as one of the weakest cards in the game. So that's from the forums when it was released. So worst card in the game, and yeah, sorry about that. It's my bad with the numbers. So we buffed it then, like so that it would be better, so that it actually would have meaning in the game. But we buffed it a little bit too much, so that was like straight after the buffs. So the community sentiment changed quite a lot. But the cool thing, yeah, sorry about that as well, but we've nerfed them since a few times. But the cool thing is that we had the counters in the game, and players found those counters, and they used those counters, and the metagame evolved. But so it didn't break the game. It's not an excuse to make bad balancing, but it is like it helps to keep the game like at least running. It helps it keep like interesting. That there is this safety net, there is the possibility, and it keeps the metagame evolving. So it was kind of a state where we had a bit of an unhealthy metagame, but it wasn't broken in any means. All right, so that was Elite Barbarians. So the first principles: make everything feel overpowered, but everything needs a counter. And at this point, I need to like make a nod towards like another great developer, and a talk like there was. These two principles were heavily inspired by this talk from Rob Bardot, Blizzard's approach to multiplayer game design. You can find this talk online. You should check it out. It's really good. This has really been a great inspiration in the development of Clash Royale, this talk, also in the early development of Clash Royale, and Blizzard games in general have been like a great inspiration for Blizzard, for Supercell all the time. So it's like, yeah, don't take my word for like those principles. They are like proven in other places as well. So thank you, Blizzard. All right, so let's move on to the next thing. So let's talk a little bit about making new cards and balancing old cards. So one thing that's important for us is to make new cards meaningful. So the point is that new cards should be played when they are released, and they should be interesting for the players, and they should have an effect. So if you think about what I said were the goals of balancing, if we think that it's fun, variety, and freshness, then if the card isn't used, then it doesn't like affect these at all. It doesn't add to the fun, it doesn't add to the variety, and it doesn't add to the freshness. So it's important that the new card is meaningful and is good so that it's actually used. And something I want to bring up here now is that like people often talk about that, yeah, like we only make new cards powerful so that like we monetize better. We just grab the money, and you can look at, maybe it wasn't exactly the case with Elite Barbarians, for example, there. But the thing is that this is not really true. Like I really think that if you have monetization as a goal for balancing, then I think that's like really hurtful for the gameplay, both in short and especially in long run. I mean, obviously there are places where we think about monetization, but balancing is absolutely not one of those places. When we think about all the interactions and all that, it's difficult enough like without thinking about monetization at that point. So yeah, wanted to clear that out. All right, so make new cards meaningful. One way to do it is that we always try to fill a gameplay gap. So maybe there's some strategy that's missing, or maybe there's like some counter or archetype that it like could be there. And as an example, I have the Ice Spirits. It's a 1 elixir single unit that sacrifices itself to deal some damage and to also freeze all the targets. And the idea here was to create an alternative to the 1 elixir skeletons, which was the only 1 elixir card at the time. Also, the Zap was widely used, very versatile card, still is, and it was like we wanted to create like an alternative to the quick freeze mechanic and the kind of the stun mechanic there. And also we had previously released the Fire Spirits. It was a cool mechanic. They sacrificed themselves to like create kind of this fireball effect. So we wanted to like utilize that mechanic and like explore that character a little bit more. So that's how the Ice Spirit was born. But also what's important is with the balancing is always to keep the old cards relevant. So we make new cool cards, but we really want the old cards to still have a meaning in the game, so that you still use them. So things like the Baby Dragon and the Mini Pekka, that they would that they wouldn't become obsolete because new cards would be like distinctively better. So if we fill gameplay gaps instead of just doing like I think kind of lazy route would be to like just create better cards compared to the old one. So we would just do a Baby Dragon that is just better than the old Baby Dragon. But that's not a really, doesn't sound very interesting, and doesn't sound like it would be a good idea in the long run, really. So, and one thing with the with keeping old cards relevant is that we want to stay true to the soul of the card when we do rebalancing. So essentially that means that we try to avoid complete reworks. We instead do like smaller changes by changing basic stats. And so with reworks, I mean that you would like really change like completely the behavior of the card. This makes it like a bit easier to predict the effects, first of all, but also it's important to note that like there are a lot of players who play with those cards already, and not everybody like reads really meticulously like all the changes that have been happening. So I think it's like really important that the cards ideally play just like they played before. So you can still deploy it on the same spot. You can it still acts a bit like similarly that it did before. If it was ranged, it's still ranged, etc. So that like if you don't read the notes and if you play a bit casually, you probably don't even notice that like something has changed. But the hardcore players, they will for sure notice the differences and the nuances, and that's cool. There are, So that's like, sometimes you want to do a rework, but that's more like making a new card almost. So you have to approach it in that way. All right. So make new cards meaningful, but keep old cards relevant. And something that we established like very early on, like from beta already, is that we want to keep on rebalancing. That's something we felt that's the right way to do it. So we've been doing like semi-regular balance changes roughly once per month. And there's no exact science to this cadence of 1 month. It just felt like that's the pace where it kind of feels like the metagame is stale, getting a little bit stale, and there's like some need for something to get a bit freshed up. So it felt like a good cadence. And now things have become like a bit different. We are releasing cards in a different way. We had 2 weeks cadence on releasing cards. Now we have 1 month cadence on releasing cards. We're testing out a little bit different things, and we're still keeping the once per month cadence for balance changes, but things might change. And something to note is also that this is different from game to game. So you gotta figure out what's good for you. Like the metagame also needs some time to evolve. Like you can't just be there changing it all the time, because then there's not enough time for it to like find its place and for people to figure out the counter strategies. And the risk that is there is that if you do it too frequently, or if like, or otherwise as well, like it might be that players actually start to take the balance changes as a crutch, that they actually that they feel like, you know, that I don't want to, like, I'm just rolling my thumbs. I don't want to figure out what the counter is now to this card. I'm just going to wait for the balance changes. They're going to, like, it's so OP that they're sure they're going to nerf it, and then maybe we won't nerf it, and then they are like totally confused. So you got to find that balance between like being a crutch and like having players like lean towards you and not actually like figuring out these things themselves, versus like managing the expectations and managing the frustration that the players might have to like addressing these imbalances that might exist. Right. And something we noticed when doing these different kinds of changes is that like buffs are nicer than nerfs. But it's kind of natural when you think about it, because nerfs usually hit the cards that most people use. So obviously when we nerf a card and I don't know, 80% of the player base is using it, there's quite a lot of people who are getting like angry about it. But then, while buffs, again, like they usually hit cards that only a few use, so those who use it are super happy, and those who don't, they might be like a bit indifferent about it, because, you know, like they don't have to deal with that card usually, and also it's kind of, they might find it cool that, you know, a new card is like might be in the meta. So we try to do buffs, but, you know, sometimes you just have to do nerfs because it doesn't make sense to like buff all the other cards. All right. So when we do these changes, communication is extremely important. So it's not just about informing players what was done. It also helps manage the expectations. The goal of buffing cards is never to make them totally OP. The goal of nerfing cards is never to kill them from the game. They should, ideally, they always still have like a place there. So to explain a little bit about the reasons, the background, the context, why was the changes done, and what might the ramifications be, etc. We do this by communicating in our blog and in the game, in the inbox. We talk about like the balance changes and the context, but also something that helps a lot is that the active YouTubers and the active community, they really often bring like bring depth to the in-depth views on the changes and the ramifications, and they analyze them a lot. So that's like super helpful, and we're in a very fortunate position to have that kind of community. So you keep on rebalancing and knowing that buffs are nicer than nerfs. I'm a Finn, so I can't stay away from a bottle too long. So sorry about that. All right. All right. So that was the principles, basically, that I covered today, and then a little bit about the decisions. So how do we decide which cards to rebalance? So there's 72 cards in the game right now. It doesn't make sense to tamper with everything every time, so and at once, because it's too big of a change, and the ramifications become like totally impossible to predict. So how do we decide which ones do we tackle? There's no exact science to this, but I feel that it really boils down to like 3 different like main areas. So we listen to the players. That's super important. We look at the data, but at the end of the day, we have to make the decision ourselves, so we have to rely on our intuition and our knowledge of the game, and we have to also develop that knowledge. So all right, so let's start with players. So listen to the players. We are, as I said, we're very fortunate to have this really big, really passionate and active community, and many of the best players in the world are actively writing strategy articles, doing videos, and analyzing the cards and the metagame. And the community and the players, they can't and they shouldn't do the decision for you, but it's an invaluable tool to have to listen to them and to get the pulse from them. And there's of course there's always conflicting opinions there, but it's really healthy to follow that discussion, I feel. So so you get a good pulse of the players' feelings, you know. You often have to look a little bit between the lines to get to the root of the problem. You know, complaints about a certain card balance might sometimes actually mean that there's a lack of variation, for example. It's not necessarily that that specific card is bad. It's more like there are no real options to that card, for example. And one thing that's worth realizing is that after a game has matured, the developers are not really the best players of their game, and the players can really teach you about the game. So yeah, embrace this, swallow your pride, stay humble. There's a lot to learn from the players, and I have an example of where this really struck us the first time. That was this video. It was in April last year, a little bit after the 1 month after the global launch. So there's this pretty popular YouTuber called Yarn from Orange Juice. This video, I think, made him famous. We featured this in game, and yeah, we saw this, and then we were the team was watching the video, and we were like, holy, this! So this is what you can do with the one elixir skeletons, and so yeah, I feel that at that moment, the whole team learned quite a lot. We not just about the skeletons. A lot of players learned about the skeletons that day, and we had to nerf them pretty soon after that. But yeah, but we also learned about the game and about the fact and this concept that the players really can teach you about the game. So lesson learned on this one, very valuable lesson. And something that's also related to listening to the players is that the top players are trendsetters, like Yarn, for example. So they have access to all the cards. They tend to experiment and craft new decks to outwit their opponents, right? And to gain the edge. And quite often the trends then slowly trickle downwards. A concrete example of this is from esports and live tournaments, and we witnessed this for the first time in our first ever official Clash Royale tournament, which also happened in April. So that was a pretty cool learning month for us. So we had in Helsinki a live tournament with players from all over the world, but mostly from Finland. And there was this one guy who ended up winning, the young Finnish guy called Jason. He ended up winning the whole tournament. He got to the finals on stage, and he beat every single opponent on stage 3-0. And those opponents included some of the top players at that point, people were expecting them to win easily. And he had this deck that no one else had ever really tried, and it immediately got dubbed to the Jason deck. It had very basic cards, so it was easy to do this deck in the game. And yeah, after the tournament, we really saw the effects of how of esports and top players being the trendsetters when we saw the use rates of this deck go up. So yeah, that was an interesting lesson. Fun fact, actually we ended up really, because of this, only touching the elixir collector, but at the end of the day, that was the problematic part. That's a different story. Right, so top players are trendsetters. So listen to the players, learn from them, it's super important. But to get kind of a second opinion, you should also look at data. So utilize data, and for us, it means mostly looking at use rates and win rates. So a little bit of definition time. For us, use rates mean the percent of battles where a player owned the card and used it, and the win rate, the percent of battles where a player used this card and won. And we also look at both like at individual cards, at different trophy levels, and in challenges separately, and also the full decks that players use. So what do players use and why do they win? That's what we look at. So what do we read out of these metrics? So first to mention maybe is that the use rates are the main metric that we look at out of these two. Because the use rate really, like if the goal is the healthy metagame, then use rate tells where we are with that. Like, are there several deck archetypes in there? And are those game styles that are used, could we consider them as fun, etc. So that's what we look at. And when you look at the different arenas, you get a feel of what the players kind of see, like what kind of decks are they encountering at 3,000, at 2,000, at top 100, in challenges, etc. So it's a pretty powerful tool to have. And win rates also tell stories. Like you can, for example, see sleeper cards from there, like a card that has like low use rate, but has really high, exceptionally high win rate. So that's an indicator that maybe that card is in a fairly good place, and maybe we shouldn't at least buff it even if it has a low use rate, because like actually like those players who are using it are seeing like a lot of success with it. Maybe it requires a lot of skill to use, but that's gonna also be like a good aspect if it's at least powerful and brings success. So win rates tell stories too. And something to note is that this is like what we use for in our game. And in other games, you should really like think about like what fits your game. So I don't know exactly, but I would imagine that, for example, in Hearthstone, it's very useful to look at things like win rates across the different classes, like how does Warlock perform against Mage, against Hunter, etc. And to keep the different classes, because they're so separate from each other, to keep them balanced between each other. Or Street Fighter, that you look at the different characters and the heroes and how they perform versus each other, what are the win rates in the different matchups. So think about your game, like how does it work? What's like good in which data is good for your game? All right. So then the question is, what is a good use rate? So we have 72 cards in the game. You have 8 cards per deck, so that's roughly 12 billion different permutations. That's quite a lot. So if everything would be used perfectly evenly, then the average use rate would be 11.1. But that's not really realistic. Like, you know, you wouldn't like have this type of deck, for example, like everything is the most expensive card in the game. I see a gentleman there's changing his deck, like, yeah, that's good. All right, so what is then a good use rate? Like, if that's not the goal, then what is? So then it boils down to really like understanding what your game is, how does it work? So we look at use rate and we start to ponder, like, okay, why is a card popular, for example? Why is it used so much? Quite often it might be that it's just like very powerful at that moment. But it could also be that it's very good in the current metagame, that it's countering the really overpowerful cards or the cards that are used a lot now. Or it could be a very versatile card like the Zap, that it just fits so many different decks. So it's natural that it has a high use rate, and you shouldn't like force it to be something else. So one way to look at this is to like think of like rough target use rates, not necessarily like, you know, exact numbers, but but just thinking about that, like, you know, that you have, for example, main attack cards, compare them to each other, compare direct damage spells to each other. So the main attack cards, they really should be like viable alternatives to each other. Maybe the cheaper cards, they fit a bit more different decks, but also the more expensive ones, they should be viable alternatives. They should be present in the, and you should see that in the use rates that they are used. And more simpler maybe is the direct damage spells, that you have, let's say, 1 or 2 direct damage spells in a deck that, like, are they used like somewhat, even are they all like alternatives? Do you have like Zap and Log as viable alternatives to each other, etc. So kind of compare the use rates within a smaller category. And another way, or another thing that we look at is like the spiciness of cards. So you have kind of bread and butter cards, like let's say the Barbarian. So it's a very staple card, and it's actually like these type of staple cards, like the Barbarians, is something that I'm super reluctant to like nerf or buff them. Partly also because like there are several cards that actually spawn Barbarians, etc. So you wanna they are like the baseline to which other things are compared. And also they are like it's a versatile card, or it's a card that you could for different situations or specific situations it should be like a viable alternative in different decks. And then there's like a bit spicier cards like the X-Bow. So the X-Bow is like it's this card that rapidly fires like arrows at a huge range, and if it locks to the enemy tower, it's like really devastating. And it's a card that we deliberately want to have like a bit lower use rate. We don't want it to be like among the most used strategies. But from the data, like one way to look at if a card is like at a healthy place, a spicy card is at a healthy place, is that it has like a low use rate, but it has a like good, decent, or maybe even high win rate. So those who use it, those who specialize it with, can really find success with it, but it's not like the most dominant strategy in the game. It might not be the most fun to play against X-Bow, but if it's there as a spice every now and then, it really adds freshness and variety to the game. So I think they are important to have. Other examples could be, for example, the Clone, etc. So yeah. Something also about like understanding your game is like, you have to, especially if you're doing the balancing, like you really have to like understand what your game is about. You don't have to be the best player in the world, but you have to understand what the best players are talking about. So understand things like in Clash Royale's case, like elixir advantage. Okay, defense and counter push, quite straightforward. You have multi-lane pushing, right? You have more advanced stuff like knowing all the card interactions in the game and at different levels even, and what different deck archetypes exist right now and how do they work, how do you buff or nerf the different archetypes, what kind of opening moves there are, identifying the deck cycle, breaking the deck cycle when you play, understanding spell baiting and building decks around spell baiting and playing against spell baiting. What is it? Yeah. And kiting troops, how does it work? How do you do it? The pros and cons of flying units, because it's not always good to have a unit with flying. The pros and cons of moving speed. What's the ramifications of having a slow or a fast unit, etc. The point is not now to go through all these and explain how they actually work in Clash Royale. The point is that you need to know your game. You need to understand how these concepts in your game work, so that you're able to understand the ramifications of the changes you do and the new cards you do, and also to understand what the top players are talking about, so that you can use that powerful tool of the community to your advantage. And of course, it also means that you should play your game, and that was something that was super important also during the development of the game, that the game was played a lot. The team had like every single day at 3 p.m. they played an hour of Royale, and usually in the evenings as well. And we had playables where we had a lot of people from the company were like really enthusiastically playing the game, including me, and giving feedback, talking about the balance, etc. So that really helped to understand and find those things. And still, like, we didn't know half of it when we went live with the game, as shown with the examples earlier. But just keep on learning and about your game. All right. So, listen to the players, utilize data, but at the end of the day, know your game, and you have to make the decision yourself. And the quest continues. So that was like basically the meat of the talk. But we have healthier, we have unhealthier metagames. It's a persistent game that's hopefully going to last for years. and it's a never-ending process. So new cards are added, new game modes like the 2v2 doesn't make my work easier, and the player base matures, and we also learn more and more. So it's an eternal quest that continues. So yeah, there were a lot of things in talks, but I still feel that there's so many things that are left unsaid, and I feel like I only scratched the surface, but there are lots of cool references, resources, and inspiration that I've watched and I've found really useful. So yeah, feel free to take a photo of this, for example, and check these out. I really recommend it. If you're interested in game balancing, if you're doing game balancing, check these out, dig deeper. There's a lot of cool stuff there. All right. So as a recap of the presentation, so goals of balancing offer fun, variety, and freshness, which feeds to a healthy metagame. And some of the key principles we use is to make everything feel overpowered, knowing that everything needs a counter, to make new cards meaningful but keeping old cards relevant, to keep on rebalancing, knowing that buffs are nicer than nerfs, and to decide what to do, you listen to the players, we utilize the data, but at the end of the day, we just have to know the game, play the game, and understand what we're doing. All right. I guess that's it. Thank you.
You know what's really meta? While we were talking, I was playing the game at a Supercell event and also lost. Very frustrating. Great presentation. I think these things, I mean, one could talk for hours on the issues of balance and all that. Time for questions. We still have a few minutes. Okay, hands immediately up. You're very close. You're going to start.
Scary.
Thank you for an amazing talk.
Thank you.
I think it might be an occupational hazard when I play Clash Royale. I sometimes, very often actually, I fantasize about all the imaginary new features and new modes that might have made the game even more awesome or more fun, or they might ruin the game as well. I don't know. But the question is, how do you resist the temptation of not adding those? I'm sure you have a really long backlog. How do you resist the temptation of adding those sexy new features to the game, and instead focus on things like you rebalancing of the cards?
Yeah, I don't know if we can resist that temptation. Like we try to put stuff like 2v2, for example. It was just something I don't know how many have tried 2v2, but there's actually like a 2 versus 2 mode in the game where you in real time play with a friend against others. So whenever we can, whenever we find the time, it's of course always like prioritizing, but we try to squeeze in some new game mode and figure out, because we noticed that they are like really fun. We started off with blind deck challenges and with draft modes. Initially, we were really scared of like losing the focus from like that there would be like too many different things and it would complicate the game too much. Like the UI simplicity and all that, the feature simplicity has been something that's been like really important for the game. So we were a bit reluctant to do like those different game modes, even if they were talked about early. But then we felt that the challenges are a really good place to do it. So we tried them out, and now we have a huge backlog of different ideas and more cool. There's a lot of cool ideas in the community, and I don't know if we can resist the temptation. We try to do them whenever we can. So squeeze in some.
All right. Who's next? Over there. Throw it. Thank you.
Hi, Tatu from FuturePlay. I wanted to know a bit more about when you create your cards. There's a lot of attributes. So is there like a process towards finding out which could be the right values? Just like checking out Goblin Hut, it has its own hit points, spawn speed, deploy time, lifetime, and it spawns goblins. It has hit points, damage, hit speed, so on and so on. And they also have their elixir cost. So how do you approach setting these values?
There's not really like any strict process to that. where we just tend to put stuff in the game, try it out like internally, like in the dev build, and see if it works, and then start tweaking from there. And yeah, I want to give like a shout out to Tuomas Volotinen in our team, a client programmer. He very often does the initial balancing and the very first version of a card when it goes in, and we bounce around the balancing ideas a lot with him. So yeah, he's kind of part of the balancing team in a way, if there is such a thing. But when we go further from that, it's like, or nowadays, also about comparing to other cards that are in the game. So let's say we had the Goblin Hut. So when we did the Furnace that spawns fire spirits, we compared it a bit to Goblin Hut. That okay, how does this compare? Should it have more or less hit points? What would be a suitable elixir cost? Maybe because Goblin Hut costs 5, maybe we should try to balance this at 4 so that it's a different elixir cost. It spawns fire spirits. They have these stats. So what would be you just kind of drill into that one card and think about all those different points of view. That we have fire spirits at 2 elixir. It spawns 3. So if this comes with a certain pace, then maybe this would be a good pace, and then we try it out. Okay, it felt like it was too often, or it was too slow. Let's tweak it a little bit. So no strict process. There's no magical formula that tells you the truth. It's really about very iterative process. You put stuff in, you test it out, you tweak them, you see if it's fun. Of course, if it's a bad card, if it feels really shitty, you just throw it away, and then you make a focus on the ones that are interesting and try to drill down. So yeah, I don't know, maybe that answers the question. Very iterative process at the end of the day. Hello.
Do you play on new kinds of attributes for new cards? I mean, you have flying units, ground units, melee units, range units, but do you try to actively invent, new attributes basically?
Yeah, we do actively think about those as well. That what would be cool stuff that we haven't tried. Some we kill, some we develop a little bit further. 2 recent cards, for example, the Bandit has this dash ability that it dashes from a range and it becomes immune when it is in the dashing state. So there are new abilities and new attributes that we do. Just try to be careful that we don't make them too complex. That's something that we value quite highly. That we don't make the game and the new cards too complex. It becomes harder and harder, of course, because we have already made quite many of the basic, or already the basic set of cards that we went live with contained quite a lot of these basic archetypes, like the ranged unit and tank and etc. But there's a lot of cool ideas still in the backlog, and a lot of, again, from the community as well, a lot of cool ideas coming. So we still have ideas.
That's all we have time for. Let's give the man a round of applause.
Thank you.